Guidance, and I am here with my friend Jonathan Towner, who is the CIO of LSI Industries. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm good. Happy to be here. So appreciate the time and looking forward to a good conversation.
Absolutely. Jonathan and I met, gosh, maybe actually, we met 3 years ago. You spoke on a panel, the first ever technology event that I went to, the circuit. I uh I was but a wee sales rep, which I still am. I'm 28, right? But I would have been 25 and had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know what the difference between Java and JavaScript was, right? Like I
Oh,
thought it
there you
was
go.
all the same.
Yeah.
And it went up to that event at MadTree, and you were on that panel. Jessica Allen was on that panel, and then
hmm
Steve Brunker was on
And
that
Steve Brunker
panel.
was also.
Who,
Yep.
yeah, yeah, and for the record, too, three of the best like tech leaders to have on a panel for a sales rep that has no idea what he's doing. Just kind people. But it's funny when I think back to that circuit that event. I showed up 10 minutes late to the event, which not a great idea. And when I sat down, the panel had just started, and so I sat
Yep.
down, and I think the first comment that I heard was a quip about sales reps that lie. And I felt totally uncomfortable sitting there because I was like the only salesperson amongst the whole group, and I was late. And so it felt like Jessica had no idea who I was. And we interviewed her previously, but she had no idea who I was. But I felt totally uncomfortable at that point.
Oh, that's
Lo and
funny.
behold, I ended up building a friendship with really all three of you now. So
Absolutely. Yep.
yeah, so thank you for your time, Jonathan. So
Sure.
let's kick our conversation off here. Tell me a bit about kind of your early life experiences. So maybe what it was like for you as a kid, as your adolescence, in your teenage years. Just talk about how that kind of shaped your upbringing, shaped your perspective on leadership and problem solving.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to. And it was kind of fun. I was going back through a little bit of prep work and looking at the questions and things and um, it forced me to go back in time a little bit on the Wayback Machine and think through some things that I hadn't thought about in a long time. So I really enjoyed the whole process. And um, really kind of one of the earliest things that sticks out to me was I grew up down in Dallas, and we had a program where they would actually pull you out of school a couple of days a week, and it was a completely different approach to education and thinking. And it was really centered on logic problems and forced you to kind of look at inputs and look at conclusions and apply logic to it. And really kind of what I took out of that was logic and data and the inputs drive the outcomes. And so if you're frustrated with kind of the outcome of a decision or the outcome of a process, or the outcome of a business, don't get mad at look at your inputs and what inputs can you change. How can you change those? How can you change the conversation? And that applies, I think, to leadership and as well, because if you're getting a decision back from somebody that you're talking about that you don't understand or you don't like, try to put yourself in their logical process and evaluate the same decision and see if you come up with the same answer. And if you do, see what inputs you can change, and maybe you can change the outcome. So that was a really interesting kind of early life exposure that I hadn't thought about in a long, long time.
That is interesting. There's like two sides of that coin because so I remember when I was younger, I gleaned some similar lessons from some mentors in my life, and it was the idea that like hey, if somebody makes a mistake and they're in your purview or you're leading them, what you ought to do is instead of blaming them, look at how you contributed to that situation and then take ownership for that failure. And there's certainly, when you're in a position of leadership, that's a critical and humble and important thing to do. The other side of that's interesting too, because not all problems, I think, we not all failures, I think we ought to own, and not all
Yep.
things ought to be our responsibility. But in the circumstance you're describing there, that's a great lesson to have learned. But what is the school that you're talking about, man? Like, is this some
Yeah.
like Montessori
No, ironically,
academy? Like,
it was ironic. It was public school down in Dallas. I was part of the Richardson School District, and they had a program that was called Reach, and they tapped a subset of the students in there, and they would bus you over to a different school, and totally different learning style, totally different exposure. And so I think it was at least 2 days, if not 3 days a week, in that environment versus traditional classroom.
okay.
But that was kind of really looking back on it now, it makes sense with, you know, kind of how I make decisions today and the level of logic and data that I apply to decision making. And it was, I think its roots actually were all the way back then. You know, I think that was like
Wow.
third grade. And it's been a minute since then, but that was
The
one of the
the
earlier ones.
reach the reach program. We just gave a great free advertisement for some public
I don't even know if it's
school.
still there. You know, I hope it is, because it was a phenomenal program. You know, I really do hope that it's still down there. I'll have to look into it. So, um,
Sure,
you know, so that was kind of
sure.
the first one, and then obviously, you know, when you're in that age, your family and you know, your parents and things have a massive impact on that. Um, you know, and so in a, you know, church, and my parents, you know, taught me, you know, on a routine basis that, you know, all people are value. You know, there's nothing. Um, a lot of times the difference between somebody that's, you know, kind of in an entry level all the way up to a CEO, a lot of that, you know, the difference there lies in the opportunity that they're given and what they make out of it, not necessarily a representation of their intrinsic value. And so if you treat people that way, you know, the same treatment from, you know, bottom to top, and you're the same person always, then, you know, that's reflected back on you. And it's, um, you know, so that was another big kind of life lesson if I go all the way back to my early kind of formative years. But, um,
That's honestly some great wisdom there. And you know, it's funny, like when going back to the story I was just telling you, like when I started in my role, this had been 3.5 years ago now. I was coming off of I worked in full-time ministry for 4 years, and I worked with people, and I really love people. I think if you're in sales, you have to love people if you want to be good at sales. Um, and I didn't have an appreciation though for what they were going through every week with multiple kids getting to school and then working a job. And that job is probably more than 40 hours a week, even what they tell you as a kid, it's 40-hour work weeks. And
yep.
like, yeah, and you think all these things, but and then when you actually move into that context and you start doing that yourself, it's for me, it was very intimidating, and I was very afraid coming to that event. I was like,
Yep.
who am I, this youth pastor in recovery of 2 years, going to this event and trying to talk to
Yep.
CIOs and VPs of tech at that time, Hillman Group, Skidmore, and
Yep.
LSI. And I felt
Hmm.
totally in over my head, man. But now fast forward 3 years, 3.5 years later, like we're all just human beings, man. Like
Yep.
it's everybody, we're all human beings. We've all got problems. We've all got families. We all got hobbies, interests. Like
Absolutely.
yeah. I think
Yep.
that's such a great lesson to learn for any person, but especially for young people specifically. Of like, hey, that person that you look up to is really impressive. Whatever they do is maybe they're really good at it vocationally, but they're really just another human being.
Yeah,
And um,
they are. And they put
yeah,
themselves in, and, you know, kind of, you know, been lucky along the way too. I will tell you that, you know, and, you know, there's a lot of, you know, to kind of position yourself for success, or make your own luck, is, you know, a lot of things that other people say, but it's the same sort of concept. You got to be out there, you got to be doing it, you got to expose yourself to it. And, yeah, and then what you're talking about is kind of how your lens changes over time, right? And how you see the world. And then all of a sudden you start to appreciate other people's life experiences that haven't been the same as yours, and gives you a little perspective on things. But yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So tell me about your core values then. So you kind of just alluded to them of how your folks church growing up and school, how those influenced you. What are some of your values that you hold?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, kind of right along those lines. You know, it was a mentor of mine a long time ago. Kind of, you said to me at one point, "You've got two ears and one mouth, and you should always use them in that ratio." You know, it's I try to live by that as frequently as I can. You know, kind of the crux of that is, you know, you're always going to be learning, and there's always going to be something you don't know. And so if you can find a way to kind of close your mouth and listen to others, you're going to learn something, no matter who the audience is. And so I try to live that as much as I can, especially in a leadership role. A lot of folks tend to kind of want it to be their spin on the world and their way of doing things. And if you actually listen, you know, you can pick up on additional needs that you would have missed, mistakes that you know could have avoided. Um, you know, and so that one sticks with me quite a bit. I've got a you know, kind of in some of the other life experiences and things too. I went through commissioned officer training in the Air Force. I had a scholarship to medical school. So my background to get into IT is very weird, but that one was my first pretty solid dose of, I'll say, humble pie in a leadership role where I got led down the wrong path, and I came across very hard, and kind of completely forgot that I have to be still leading a team, and I have to understand those team members' strengths and weaknesses, and get the best out of the team in its entirety. I can't just dictate the results that you want, right? So failed miserably in that. And I will tell you, I probably learned as much from that experience as I did from some of the others where I had some success. And it was a lot because I couldn't shut up long enough to listen. So
It's really, yeah, that's really insightful there. Share a bit about that career journey for you, which is a bit unorthodox. I know we've talked offline about that before, but
yep.
share a bit about how you landed in a tech leadership role when that certainly wasn't what you had sought out right when you were younger.
No, not by any stretch. And in fact, I had no intention of doing it, but it's kind of like the logic decision making and things, how interesting how bits and pieces that you pick up along the way shape who you are. But no, I started and from a very early age wanted to be a doctor and had everything kind of lined up. I had acceptance to med school when I went into undergrad and didn't really think about it. Had the scholarship through the Air Force to do that as well. And so what it afforded me was really the opportunity to take different coursework and do different things throughout my undergrad years that I otherwise would have been just fully science loaded. So I took a lot of economics, I took a lot of business courses, and kind of knew in the back of my head that even if I wouldn't gone through and finished my medical degree, that I wanted to get into the business side of medicine. And then got into medical school, and it just didn't fit for me. I loved the science, I loved the diagnostic process, but I knew it wasn't necessarily my path as a career, and so got out of that and went back to school. I had a gap there to make up from my peer group. Sitting there in my mid-20s, they're in their early 20s. We're both starting careers, so I went back and got an MBA from to kind of plug that gap and try to level the playing field a little bit. And through that process, got exposed to a company called MAG, and was able to join them in promotional marketing, which was actually my concentration in my MBA. Kind of went about things and got exposed to competitive and business intelligence through that, and started kind of gathering data and analyzing data. Turns out I wasn't terrible at it, and the head of that business came to me at one point and said, "You're not terrible at the tech stuff. How would you feel about running IT?" So that's
There you go.
been whatever it's been, 15 plus years ago now, and been loving it ever since.
So there's three different vocations in there. So originally you're thinking the medical field, and then you were in marketing and specifically analyzing advertising data, if you will, and that kind of led you into a technology type role there. So I bet you that those three different areas probably have given you maybe a bit of exposure to um, maybe the market in a different way. It's kind of like I hate to use this as an example, but a politician, if a vocational politician, could never know what it's like to be running a business or be a business
Yep.
leader, because that's the world they grew up in, right?
Right.
Likewise, like I have a ministry background, so I can certainly connect and understand the challenges of a youth pastor or a pastor in a way that other people just can't. And so in that sense, you've probably those different learning experiences give you a different perspective on your current job. I think that they probably influence greatly how you lead, how you add value to people, and they probably give you some unique pieces of advice that you're providing to your team after, of course, you're listening to them first. But what is your approach to fostering a kind of a innovative environment, or how are you fostering a technology culture at how would you suggest fostering a technology culture inside of an organization?
Yep. Well, I mean, kind of similar to you when you walked into that first meeting and were a little bit intimidated and not uh, tell people all the time, don't be afraid to ask the quote unquote stupid question, right? If you have that question, chances are somebody else does as well. And you'll find out pretty quickly that for the most part, people are eager to help and people are eager to kind of provide mentorship and leadership and guidance. But if you don't ask, you're never going to get the answer. And so don't be afraid to put yourself out there. Um,
Like that's the biggest lesson for a new sales rep, by the way, is like, especially in IT, man, like there's so many stupid acronyms that
oh God,
like
the acronyms are crazy, aren't they? Yeah,
yeah, it's bananas. I was, especially when I meet with enterprise companies, man, like those folks think a mile a minute and they go so deep into their area. You gotta really peel back anyways, man,
yep.
keep going. I'm right there with you. Ask questions. Don't be
You
afraid.
have to, you have to. And then you got also from a lot of times you can fall into kind of the almost an echo chamber, and so the more you specialize and the more that you narrow down, you were talking about how deep some people go. You can get into that echo chamber sort of a mindset. And so you've got to, you have to come at it from, again, back to the kind of the lens, you've got to come at it from the other side of the table and understand that, the people that you're putting technology in front of don't live and breathe this every day, right? They're worried about getting, a product built and put in a box and sent out the door. They're worried about getting the invoice out. They're worried about collecting. They're worried about different functions and different jobs. They're not worried about, which button you click and in which order and all that kind of stuff. And so you've got to have that balance and that understanding that not everybody is living it the way that you are. And so you've got to kind of eliminate those assumptions. And a lot of that comes down to communication and organizational change management, and understanding how other people see tech, and it's not always favorable. But you've got to be willing to kind of, again, make yourself uncomfortable and ask those questions, and make them comfortable asking those questions.
Do you find yourself acting as a consultant to your own organization?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest things, that you've seen transition over time with kind of the head of the IT, department, or the head of the IT function within a business, and how that's evolved. Is, you're seeing a lot more what I would just call general business leaders that kind of focus on or leverage technology. And that's really kind of more of the CIO role to me today, as opposed to in the past where you were, the head of the data center, or, the head of that specific application. You've really got to be out there and talking to your peer level. Um, it's important for the organization to recognize that as well, and put that role, to firmly have a seat at the table, because it's, long gone are the days where this was an outgrowth of finance, and all you were there was to kind of make the books get closed faster and that sort of thing, right? There's almost no aspect of the business that we don't touch as a technology group, which is exciting, and it gives you a lot of opportunity. But again, you've got to take it and you've got to go put yourself out there. You've got to go sit with the business leaders. And when you don't understand something, why are you focused on this component of cost? How does margin impact things? How does EBITDA impact things? Um, and that really kind of gets into how you can, translate that into your team. I don't talk a lot in terms of I want to go spend X, Y, or Z on a new tech stack. I talk a lot of terms, and I get, my team is starting to do it as well, which is great. Of, we talk in terms of, we're a half lighting company and a half display solutions company. So how many lights is somebody going to have to go sell, to clear enough funds at the end of the day to go make that incremental spend? And understand what your ask of the business is, instead of getting so frustrated that they're not getting the investment. Understand, to get that investment, somebody's got to go, make product and sell product.
That's a That's a great message that you've got there, man. I can't tell you how many tech leaders I talk to that are grumpy that their department or organization is underfunded, and
Yep.
we've been needing a cybersecurity analyst or engineer for this many years. And
Yep.
what your spin there is, well, that certainly might be true, but we have to enable the business to grow and get to that to a level in which that can happen. And that seems like a very simple idea, but I think when you're buried in your own context and in your own responsibilities, you might not be thinking that way.
It is, and it's such a foregone conclusion, right? I mean, for those of us that are in the world, it's table stakes. It's greens fees. You have to have cybersecurity. You have to have certain things. And to some extent you do, but it doesn't mean you don't have to communicate that need to the business, and it doesn't mean you don't have to sell. You and I are in different titles and positions, but at the end of the day, I do a heck of a lot of selling too. It just happens to be internally, and but that's a lot of what the role is conveying that value that we bring to the table, and you're convincing somebody to invest in you, and so you got to kind of keep grounded in that. And that's not to say I don't get frustrated. I certainly do. I would welcome, triple the budget tomorrow, but not necessarily in the cards.
Well, it's funny, man. There's like two kinds of organizations out there, and this isn't mind-blowing stuff, but there's companies that are view IT as a cost center, and there's companies that view IT as a catalyst for growth. And to
Yep.
put those terms a different way, there's companies that view IT as button pushers or task doers, and then there's other companies that view IT as valued business partners. And like in our like we're consultants, right? So we work with lots of organizations, and it really is black and white with a lot of companies. They really do
Mhm.
fall into one of these categories. And generally speaking, the ITS cost center slash task doers, generally those organizations landed that way, I think because of the people that are leading them. And what I mean by that is like these are generally speaking organizations that don't have CIOs or VPs of tech. But they certainly have an IT director. But that individual is highly, highly technical and specialized. They've been there for 10 to 15 years. They know their network and their infrastructure inside and out. And that person's very attached to that because that's part of their emotional journey with the company. And they built that whole environment from scratch. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But that type of archetype of leader at these companies, I think just it speaks right to that dichotomy of IT as cost center, task doer. Is you got to position yourself as a partner to the business if that's a culture that you want to build. Like yes, you're entrenched in day to day IT operations, but if you want to change that culture, you got to become a partner to the business and be innovative in the context of how do we grow the business. And these are all things that you're talking about and sharing about. But I see these every day with different companies that I meet and network with, and folks that I've built relationships with. How do you ensure that your IT team remains agile and responsive to changing needs inside your business?
Yep. I mean, it's a very similar story, right? If you're not out there, you're not having the conversations, then all you're going to know, you're right back into that echo chamber. So if all you do is you sit there in your office and you focus on, whatever your role is, email hygiene or data center or a specific application, you know, then you lose that connectedness, and that connectedness is really, I think, what you're talking about. So encouraging your team to get outside the four walls, and that's either outside the four walls of their office or outside the four walls of the business, or both. And quite frankly, it should be both. You should be outside. Um, you know, and you got to put yourself into that uncomfortable situation. Go out there and talk to the head of operations and say, you know, I as the infrastructure guy, the network guy, the cyber guy, I want to walk around with you. I want to see how the programs and the tools that we're putting in place are being used, how they aren't being used. Are they impediment? Are they impeding your progress? Are they enabling your progress? Um, as opposed to just sitting there kind of in a vacuum and looking at white papers and quote unquote best practices and all of that kind of stuff, right? Because the best practice ultimately is the one that's the best practice for your business. You've got to take kind of that, what the industry standards are and shoot for them in most cases. But, sometimes there are things that just don't line up based on the business that you're in. But if you're not willing to be out there and having those conversations, then you're going to miss things. And then outside the four walls of your company is, you go out to networking events, go out to conferences when you can. The circuit we've talked about kind of loosely here and there a number of times, but that's really the intent of the circuit. It's not necessarily the content in the panels. It's the value in there is the connections you have to people and learning what they're doing in their roles in their companies and how you could apply it or not. But if you're not out there and you're not going to have those conversations, you're never going to learn.
That's really good. Yeah. And I want to talk a bit about the circuit. What would you say is the number one, and if you reiterate maybe what you were just saying, that's okay. But what would you say is the number one value piece of your time with the circuit and other technology interest groups?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's no comparison to me. It's the connections that I've made, right? I've got um, there's a handful of other CIOs around the city that if I've got an issue, it's a text, it's a phone call, it's a hey, let's grab a beer or a drink or lunch and talk through. Um, it's a sounding board. They're dealing with the same sort of things at the same sorts of companies, and um, you know, kind of that at the end of the day, you're not in it alone, and go back to the two ears and one mouth. Um, it's a lot easier to solve that when you got somebody as a sounding board there that's kind of going through the same thing. So it's 100% the connections that you make. Um, it's the networking. You and I probably wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for the circuit, right?
Right. Yeah. So the answer to my question from earlier of how do you ensure your IT team remains agile and responsive to needs? So the second one you shared was, hey, network, build relationships, get to know other technology leaders, kind of build your tribe out of folks that you can touch base with over a beer or coffee or food, whatever it might be. The first one to that is also pretty insightful because you kind of jumped right into, hey, maybe go walk the floor with somebody in your
Mm-hmm.
shop, right? Maybe go see what their life is actually like, and how
Yep.
you're enabling them to do their job. What so that's an example of this question I'm about to ask. What are other ways you have prompted your team, or what are other ways that you can prompt IT leaders to go out and be part of the business and see what's going on out there? Like certainly shadowing somebody
Mm-hmm.
is a way to do that. What are some other suggestions you would have for somebody that's trying to grow that culture in their organization?
Um, it's funny because we see all the names, typically because we're looking at Active Directory, we're looking at all that kind of stuff, right? Um, and so you recognize all the names. Whether or not you recognize the faces is a pretty clear indication as to whether or not you're out walking around and knowing the business. And so I would suggest to somebody, pick a particular interest or a particular area that you want to focus on. Maybe you really like the way things are manufactured. Maybe you really kind of get into uh, the accounting side of it. Whatever interest you may have, and kind of look through that roster and see, what roles are in my company. What would I like to learn about? You know, and then just go have a conversation. You know, shoot them a note. It'd be a welcome change, I think, in their days a lot of times too, to break up the monotony and just have somebody from, you know, I know I like it when the other businesses or business units come in and ask me questions about what we're doing in IT, why we're doing it, how we're doing it. So I would welcome that for the IT folks to get out into the business and really experience it. Because if you lose that connectedness, you lose what you're supporting. Um, you're going to color your decisions, and they may not be the best decisions that you could make.
Sure. Sure. So moving into my last couple of questions here, what does it take to be successful as a CIO in today's market? And you
Yep.
can't just say relationships, right, with great other tech leaders.
Yep.
Give me something, give me a unique thought there.
Yep. I don't know about unique, but it's a lot of it we've talked about in numerous kind of different parts along this conversation. But a lot of it is that you've got to just be a general business leader. At its core, um, you are a liaison, you're a sounding board, you are a translator in some cases. You mentioned all the acronyms. Um, if you're bringing those acronyms into your larger business meetings, I think you're doing something wrong. You got to be able to translate it into um, kind of general business speak and translate it into business driven outcomes, right? So I mentioned things like EBITDA and ROI. All of your decision making, all your prioritization kind of has to be based on that. And if you don't think that way, then you're not going to. I don't think you're going to resonate as well with your peer group. It's very great to see that in many cases now the CIO is at the table. The CIO is considered one of the business leaders. Um, and I tend to I've seen the other side of that, and so I relish that we're there, and I don't want to lose that. So it's I tend to try to forget as much tech jargon as I can when I go into those meetings and talk in terms of what's driving them, what are their outcomes, what sort of sales targets do they have, what sort of margin targets do they have, and how do I positively impact that?
Dude, no one cares about your Cisco networking equipment
Nope.
in that executive team meeting.
No, unfortunately, and you talked about it too, with like, the tech director that kind of grew up into the role, right, and just loves that and just lives that, and it's such a hard thing, and you're not discounting it when you say that, right? I would never discount somebody who's spent a lifetime of learning in a specific niche or functional area, but you got to understand that, that's not what makes that group tick. So make your conversation relevant, right?
We can go really, we do a lot of cybersecurity work at our company. Man, we can go really deep on different threat actors and different groups that are causing disruption in the market, and going deep in what happened in AT&T and other big cyber attacks. Like we can go, I can go one or two levels deep, but our guys can go 10 to 20 levels deep, right? But
Mhm.
there's not a soul, like there's not a single soul that I meet with or I network with that is a decision maker that wants to go that deep on those different topics. They just want to
Yep.
know, like, is this somebody that I can trust, right? That's what it's about at the end of the day, is can
Mhm.
you build trust and instill confidence in somebody?
Yep. How do you distill all that information and all that knowledge into 3 points on a slide, right? Because that's generally what you're given. And how do you take that whole conversation? It's um, I get the opportunity to present to our board, at least once, if not twice a year, and I've got to take all of that and distill all that information down into the 3 or 4 points that are going to stick with them. And so how do you do that? How do you kind of translate that as in many cases, I'm a translator or a liaison or a go-between. And so how do I take all of that and distill that down into 3 or 4 relevant points that are going to the um, lead the group to the outcomes that you think the business needs. And how do you make your messaging relevant to them? It's not always easy. But
Do you ever call upon like marketing partners in the business to help you nuance the slides or visualize the data you're showing? Or are there any
yeah.
technologies you leverage for that? Very specific question, but I'm just curious.
um, I haven't gotten much into the technologies of that yet. A lot of it is looking at kind of executive dashboards and things that come out of the tools that we use, right? So whether it's, um, you know, you mentioned cybersecurity, so I think they all have that, whether it's from Arctic Wolf to Red Canary to you know any number of them that are out there. They kind of have that. I mean, even I'll pull information out of like the Verizon annual report and things like that, and try to summarize those sorts of things. So um, that's typically where I start with from the data standpoint. But I definitely I leverage the marketing and sales groups more from a almost a role play or a here's what I'm thinking. Um, you know, take a run through my slides. Tell me if you understand my points. Would you repeat back to me what you think I'm trying to get across? And I can get a pretty good read pretty quickly as to whether or not I hit the mark. So,
That's interesting. Thanks for sharing that and speaking to
yeah.
that question. So it's August. We're heading into strategic planning season for a lot of organizations, and um, every technology leader that is their fiscal years or calendar year is about to go through the process that we both go through at our companies. How would you encourage that technology leader to develop that strategic plan? What advice can you give to somebody that is going through vision casting with their teams for the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, and again, so we're touching on a lot of themes over and over and over again, and it's about those conversations. You've got to understand where the business is going. It's um, it was Gretzky, right? That was the skate where the puck isn't, or where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. And so you've got to be looking out, and it's a challenge as a tech leader because you've got to be ahead of that both in terms of tech and in terms of business. Understand, are you in growth mode? Are you in, unfortunately, retraction mode? Um, you know, are you exploring new markets? Are you learning? Are you expanding? So what are kind of the key initiatives that your business has? And then how do I bring technology in that will enable that? Because there's solutions for all kinds of things, even unfortunately in retraction mode. There's ways to pull cost out of things if you have to. It's not the opportunity or the role that we typically want to be in, but unfortunately, I've been through that as well. So it's about that. It's about understanding where you're going as a team, and um, really probing those questions. And then once you kind of have that answer and that strategic vision of where you're going as a leadership team, okay, now how do I layer tech into that? Um, you know, you also have to sometimes be a little forceful, I'll say, with identifying some risk, right? So there are things that, because the other leaders don't live it on a daily basis, and things like something as simple as I don't know, let's go with software versions. You know, nobody on the leadership team cares whether you're running server 16, server 22, server 20, whatever. They don't care, right? They do care when I say, if we don't address that problem, we will not have an ERP to operate our business in 2028, right? So, if you keep it only in terms of all your software speak, your message isn't going to get there. So identifying risk and putting it in terms that they understand and how it's going to impact them and their goals and their vision, is really, for me, how I kind of start looking at it. How do I lay together a strategy?
Great. So, Jonathan, I've got three themes from our conversations. So, first is 2 ears, one mouth. Listen
Yep.
first, ask the right questions before you prompt a response, or give a response. Sorry. Number two is partner with the business, learn the language of your company, and learn how to speak it. Speak about IT in their terms. And then three is build your network, which is really just building your community, building meaningful relationships with other folks in the marketplace that you can go to and have as a sounding board. So thank you so much for your time. This is a great conversation.
I really appreciate it. Happy to be here.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan. I'll talk to you next time.
All right. Bye bye.